So without any further ado, I'd like to call up as our first guest, our first keynote speaker this morning, Major General John Hartley.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Peter, for the introduction, which I know was written, and also for being invited to take part in what I think is a very important issue. There's something I challenge the fact speaking right now, because a good deal of what I was going to say has already been said by the previous speakers. So congratulations, gentlemen. You've done a very good job. I'm going to talk about something, ladies and gentlemen, which I think is extraordinarily pressing. 20 months ago, before I took on this job heading a research institute, quite frankly, this was not something that was remotely on my horizon. About 10 years ago, I headed our Defence Intelligence Organisation, which arguably is Australia's largest research institute of 350 analysts. We were looking essentially at our wars of the future, where they might evolve, how they might develop, what impact they could have on Australia, and so on. I don't think the word food security was even mentioned. Certainly we were looking at issues that might relate to food security, but they tended to be very much on a regional and particular basis. Nowadays, I can tell you that there is a new department in that organisation which looks at food, water and energy security, and the potential for conflict, intrastate and interstate in the future, resulting from those three issues. So I'm going to talk about something which I think is pretty topical and very important, and something which I think is only just starting, in fact, to claim our conscious attention. But it's something that's certainly going to confront us in the future, over the next couple of decades, and our children and our children's children will certainly have to deal with an issue that could, if not handled properly, become a major, catastrophic global event. Food security itself, it has a number of definitions. This is the one that's mostly used. It's debated a bit because it doesn't have the word hunger in it. But nevertheless, when we talk about food security, a household is considered to be food secure when its occupants do not live in fear of hunger or starvation. Food security, of course, requires access to safe, affordable, very important word, nutritious foods that come from local, non-emergency sources. While this appears to be, I think, a very simple definition, it's a complex issue. And there are many disciplines which interrelate on this issue. The first, of course, is that according to the World Resources Institute, global per capita food production, in fact, has increased considerably over recent decades. Now, you may not be able to see the full detail there, but certainly that trend line does suggest that over time we'd certainly have more food. And yet, the number of people who are chronically hungry increase each year. In a related factor, it was reported in 2006 that the number of people who were overweight were greater than the number of people who were undernourished. I thought that's a rather interesting sort of image. It was at that time quoted that roughly about 1 billion people were overweight, and something like 800 million people were undernourished. The BBC at the time ran a number of articles, one of which claimed that China, the most populous nation in the world, was in fact suffering from an overweight epidemic. And indeed, one of the images that was produced was that, to demonstrate just that. And certainly that image, there's no doubt at all, is true. But equally, those of you who visited rural and western China will see there are a lot of people who clearly aren't eating too much. On the other hand, India at the time, which was the second, and is the second most populous nation in the country, in the world, added 30 million people in the 10-year period from 1995 to 2005 to its list of those who were undernourished. And it was estimated that in the 1990s, something like 46% of Indian children were underweight. Today, we believe that roughly about 1 billion people are in fact suffering chronic food deficiencies. And roughly 2 billion people, in other words, almost half our total population, with those two figures combined, are in fact suffering intermittent food deficiencies. This is something that we don't recognize here. But certainly if you visit parts of the world, you will very quickly see these sorts of images. It's estimated, for instance, that something like 6 million children die each year from food deficiencies. If we translate that figure, that comes to 17,000 a day. is roughly the size of a reasonable town in country Australia. Or indeed, one child dies every 8 seconds. Those, I think, are extraordinary startling figures. Over 60% of the world's undernourished people live in Asia, and a quarter live in Africa. If you were then to equate that to the percentage of the populations, roughly 33 or a third of Africa's people are said to be undernourished, and something like 16% of Asian people are in the same category. The FAO recently released a list of countries, 22 countries, which were said to be have people who were poorly nourished. Of that 22, 16 were in Africa. Now, there are a number of causes for all this. Just working out how this works. Right. There are a number of causes for this, and you may recall that in 2008 we had a major food crisis. There were demonstrations and other activities in some 37 countries. In fact, I heard Hillary Clinton the other day said that the number was probably more like 60 countries. There were a number of reasons put forward for this, but essentially the reason for these demonstrations related to the rise in food prices. Over the previous 2 years, between 2006 and 2008, the price of rice, for instance, had increased by over 200%, that of wheat, sorghum, and soybeans by over 100%. And this is very significant, particularly when you look at where these populations are and the amount of money that these people spend on food. In the Western world, it's estimated that we probably spend about 10% of our income on average on food. The figure in the United States currently is 9%. In China, that figure is 50%. In India, which has a rising middle class and some extraordinarily rich people, the figure is 75%. So you can get a sense that if food goes up even by a small margin, very quickly that will have a major impact upon a family. This, of course, is a complex issue. When you look at all those factors there, many of them are debatable. For instance, the people involved in biofuels will say it's not quite the issue we make it out to be. In the United States, sufficient biofuel is produced, which, if the grain was transferred into food, would feed 350 million people. It's a debatable issue, though. We talk about climate change. I'll say a few words about that shortly. That's another issue which requires a great deal of debate, and for which there are, in many cases, no clear answers. So food security, ladies and gentlemen, is a complex issue. There are many disciplines that interrelate and overlap. The world population is presently estimated to be 6.96 billion people. There's little doubt that it's going to increase. Now, the level of increase has declined considerably. Had we been talking about this 20 years ago, we probably would have estimated that today on Earth we would have 10 billion people. So the level of increase has certainly slowed down considerably. In fact, growth rates peaked in 1963 when they were 2.2%. Today they're just over 1%, about 1.1%. But nevertheless, even if we take that margin, the margin rates from 2050, for instance, between 7.5 billion and 10.5 billion, there will still be a considerable increase in people. And the challenge is that the greatest increase will be in areas that currently can ill afford to have additional people, areas which are already struggling with their food and water security problems. Of course, I'm talking about areas in parts of Asia, in the Middle East, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in Latin America. I'm trying to get some sort of historical perspective on all of this, to try and get some sense of what this really means. And you can see the words on the screen behind. If we take, for instance, the Indian subcontinent, in 1750 it had 125 million people. By 1941, that population had almost increased 3 times. Today, it's 1.22 billion. It's a very significant increase. Many of you would have been to Java, a relatively small island. In 1830, Java had a population of 5 million. Today, it has a population of over 130 million. That's a significant increase. Mexico, this worries the United States considerably. Again, in 1900, it had a population of just over 13 million. Today, it has a population of 112 million. And I picked one African country, and you can see that over 80 years, the population of Kenya has gone from nearly 3 million to some 37 million. This gives you some idea of just how significant population increases have been in relatively small areas. Asia accounts for 60% of the world's population, of about 4 billion people, and if we take it on a continental basis, Africa would be second with 1 billion people. China and India, the two most populous nations in the world, account for 37% of the world's population. In some countries, of course, we have a negative growth rate. This is largely as a result of declining fertility rates. It's particularly evident in places like Central and Eastern Europe, and in the next decade, places like Japan will increasingly fit into this category as well. Indeed, sometime in the not too distant future, some 25% of Japan's population will be too old to be in the workplace. At the time that occurs, the equivalent figure for China, and this gets very little mention, will be 30%. 30% of Chinese people will be too old to work. And the issue becomes quite alarming when you recognize that China has no old age pension policy and only a very limited ability to deal with elderly people outside the family setting in its rural communities. China has a major population policy issue. These are all 30s. By 2030, some 30% of Chinese males will not have a bride. 90% of fresh water goes untreated into water systems, rivers and streams. It's estimated that roughly the 60 million people each year that now move into the cities will have 90% of fresh water goes untreated into water systems, rivers and streams. It's estimated that roughly the 60 million people each year that now move into the cities are going to areas where there is no form of sanitation. A study has shown that 75% of surface water, not underground water, in India is said to be contaminated by human, industrial or agricultural waste. The populations tend to live in rural areas, despite the fact that we are seeing megacities growing all over the place and large numbers of people going to cities. In many of the developing world, many people still live on the land. They live on the land, they live off the land, and their communities are very much supported by that process. But that's rapidly changing, particularly as much of the land is becoming less arable, and people are increasingly migrating to the cities. Last year alone, it's estimated that across the globe, 60 million people moved to cities, and many of them moved to cities which were not prepared to receive them. They don't have the infrastructure, the medical facilities, the sanitation to deal with increased populations like that. Those of you who visited India recently, for instance, and had the misfortune to drive through the outer parts of major cities will know what I'm talking about. Many countries experience perpetual food shortages. This results in something which is known as stunting. In other words, children don't receive the amount of food that's necessary for them to grow to their full potential. Stunting decreases the body size. This leads to higher levels of infant and child mortality. Once stunting has occurred, it's very difficult to recover from it. In other words, even though you may be eligible or have access to high nutritional food later in life, you can't recover this process. Stunted individuals, not surprisingly, are far more prone to disease and other forms of illness. Severe malnutrition in early childhood can also lead to defects in cognitive development. The second issue that we're looking at very clearly is access to fresh water. It's been estimated that in the next 25 years, about a generation, we will require access globally to something like an additional 4,000 cubic kilometers of fresh water. I can't even imagine what 1 cubic kilometer looks like, better than 4,000. I'm told it's the equivalent of 7 Nile basins or 8 Murray-Darling systems in full flow. The bottom line is that we will need roughly 40% more fresh water, access to fresh water, than we currently enjoy. Of course, as we all know, there's a great deal of water around the world, but getting access to it is the issue. The demand for fresh water has in fact tripled in the last century and will double in the next 21 years. By 2025, USA estimates that 1/3 of the population on the globe will face severe or chronic water shortages by 2025, less than a generation ago. Water deficits, of course, are also occurring in areas that previously didn't have this problem. We also talk about the issue of aquifers, underground water. And we're looking at falling water tables, in particular, where there are heavy population increases likely to take place. Now, it's estimated in Australia that we have sufficient artesian water to last us for the getting access to it in the right place, which is a challenge. And the same occurs globally. And you can see a number of countries there are severely affected, with serious problems likely to emerge in others in the near future. Now, another issue which is related to all of this, of course, is pollution. We talk about aquifers. Aquifers, in fact, in some parts of the world have declined considerably. In India, for instance, over the last 30 years, on average, aquifers have dropped by 200 meters. In China, the North China Plain, which is the food basket for that area, is much the same. We're also talking about the issue of pollution. Pollution is something which we don't perhaps consider very greatly here, but it certainly is having a major impact in many parts of the world. It's estimated, for instance, that in the developing world, something like 90% of fresh water goes untreated into water systems, rivers and streams. It's estimated that roughly the 60 million people each year that now are moving to the cities are going to areas where there is no form of sanitation. A study has shown that 75% of surface water, not underground water, in India is said to be contaminated by human, industrial or agricultural waste. 75%. If you believe the UN report, in fact, more Indians have access to a cell phone than they have to a toilet. I've been talking about the developing world. The United States, for instance, a developed country, a major country, has severe water problems. It's estimated currently that 36 of its states are facing water shortages of one form or another. The Ogallala Aquifer, a huge underground lake that stretches from Texas to South Dakota, over the last 50 years has fallen from an average depth of 80 meters to 20 meters. California, the state of California, if it continues to use water at its current rate, will probably run out of fresh water in 20 years' time. New Mexico, which is now the home for an increasing number of retired Americans, has got a 10-year margin. So the United States itself faces a major problem. But I think the statistic that concerned me the most, I suppose, is one that says that something like 40% of its rivers and streams and 46% of its lakes are so polluted that people no longer drink water from them, or fish, or in fact now being encouraged not to swim in them. How can that happen? What a significant issue that is to a major country. Of course, we also talk about the decline in arable land. This was mentioned by the other speakers. Certainly we recognize that intensive farming also very often leads to a vicious cycle of exhaustion of soil, decline in fertility and yields. It's now believed, and incidentally, that picture there, this was once quite adequate farming land. Anybody like to know what that is? Anybody like to guess what that is? That's in Colorado. It's not in the third world. But about 40% of the world's agricultural land currently is seriously degraded. And it's very difficult to see how that's going to change in the near future. It's estimated that by 2025 in Africa alone, Africa will have the capacity to feed only a quarter of its population. That's by 2025. But of course, we heard before the issue about rich governments and corporations buying up land to feed their own people. This in itself is a major issue that needs to be looked at. Very clearly, a number of people are now starting to point to this being an aspect of neocolonialism. And the implications of that, of course, are significant. We also talk very quickly about the issue of climate change. This is an issue which gets a great deal of debate. Now, we've always had climate change. In fact, I haven't been very long in the state. About 20 months ago when I first came here, I met a very senior politician in the state who told me we shouldn't worry about climate change. We've always had it. Climates have always changed. After all, in the 10th century, we were growing grapes in Greenland. Yeah, that might be right, but the population of the world in those days was probably about 200 million. And of course, we now have far more access to information to suggest that we see very significant changes in the climate. The problem here, of course, is that for every 10 scientists who produce volumes of information, much of which is in the sermon already, they will get less publicity than one person with no scientific background who will say the whole thing is a sham, it's a bogus. That's a challenge that we really face. All I can say, ladies and gentlemen, is that the trends that are currently in place, if they continue, it will suggest that we will have a major problem globally as a result of climate change. we talk very much about the issue of glaciers. There's a picture here. I was looking very hard to find a picture that actually tried to show the changes. Somebody, of course, will say that the pictures were taken at a different time of the day, different season, using different types of lens and so on. But at the end of the day, there is no doubt that glaciers are declining globally. We recently had a report that was put out by the UN that suggested that much of the information produced by an earlier study was wrong. And we tend to grasp that and say, that's really the answer. But the bottom line is that glaciers right now are declining. And if that decline continues, it will be severe. In the Himalayan region, for instance, some 2.4 billion people are affected. In China, in India, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, and Myanmar. The implications for intra- and interstate conflict are severe if the current trends continue. And we will need to watch that. We also recognize, of course, that in the low latitude areas along the equator, in particular, climate change has had a major impact on food production, with the result that the price of food has gone up considerably. I spoke about before how much people spend on food. It's estimated that for every 2 to 2.5% rise in food, the number of people who go into the malnourished list increases by 1%. Aridification, a new word, or desertification, is an issue that confronts all of us. Very clearly, the arid and semi-arid parts of the world are expanding. It would be, I think, not surprising, and this is not a particularly good image, but it would not be surprising if I told you that the Sahara is moving south every year by an average of 48 kilometers. And that's a measurement that's been taken over 10 years. 48 kilometers a year doesn't sound extraordinary, but take that over 10 years and look at the expanse of the Sahara, and it's a very major issue. Drylands presently occupy about 40% of the Earth's surface, and something like 2 billion people live in them. We, of course, let me very quickly, I recognize how time is going here. The conventional thinking generally in the Western world is that the market-style economy will take care of this. As food demand increases, so will the price of food rise. And so will the income earned by farmers rise. This will allow for the expansion of farms, more innovation, more development, more risks to be taken, and so on. That pretty much is the market-style economy outlook. But I think there's one warning I could put here, ladies and gentlemen. And that is that most of the people who want additional food, who will need additional food, will not be able to afford that additional food if we continue that market-style economy. How are we going to deal with that? That's an issue which very clearly requires a great deal of thinking. Let me conclude, ladies and gentlemen, by 5 observations that I've made as a result of the study which is ongoing, which we will not complete till about the middle of next year. A number of you have been involved in it, and any of you, and I recognize right now that a number of you are associates of my organization, Future Directors International. If you would like to receive our electronic product free of charge, please give me your email address, a card, or a written address, and I'll put you on the list. We currently have about 4,000 associates. Many of these are people who are involved in policy development and futuristic thinking. And we can certainly get information to them in a unique way, which I'm not seeing anywhere else. Now, the first of the conclusions that I've come to is that we do face a major global catastrophic challenge if all the trends continue the way they are. Trends that involve population, water, arable land, food requirements, and so on. My second concern, my second observation, is that this is something which is only just now starting to be grasped. The issue of food security is getting more and more mentioned, as mentioned. But it's only just starting to be grasped. And I have a sense that on a global perspective, despite the fact that G20 had it recently as an agenda item, despite that fact, on a global perspective, there is really still little understanding of what this could mean. And people who have the authority, responsibility, interest, and initiative to do things about it need to be much further aware of what's happening. Why is this? I think there are a number of reasons. Firstly, a number of these issues are quite controversial. They're still open to debate. The final conclusion is yet to be reached. We've talked about that before. A number of people have made predictions in the past which have not come true. Malthus, for instance, talking in the 1790s, had that quaint description of there being a geometric progression in terms of the rise in populations, but only an arithmetic progression in terms of the rise of food production. Later, in the 1960s, we had this man here, Paul Ehrlich, making similar sorts of predictions. Both of them were wrong at the time, and certainly in terms of how far ahead they forecast. But I suspect that today we have far more information. We have far more evidence of these issues. And I think the people who are starting to make predictions today are probably eventually going to be right. But it is an issue. We've had these predictions before and have chosen to ignore them. I think we live in the information age, or sometimes the disinformation age, where there's far more information available to us than ever before. I also question, are we any wiser? We're certainly more knowledgeable perhaps, but are we any wiser? Are we any better able to deal with events that are going to confront us in the future? Our political processes, our politicians today are no better or worse than we've had in the past. But I think they face far greater challenges today than they did in the past. They have to deal with today's problems, which are huge and complex. There isn't time to think about tomorrow's problems, let alone those of another generation. And I think finally, ladies and gentlemen, we have to deal with the issue of psychological avoidance. This is an age-old issue. If the issue is so significant, if it's going to worry us, if it's going to keep us awake, let's not think about it if we can avoid it. Then our children and our children's children or another generation do it. And I think for all these reasons, we are probably failing to grasp this very important issue. Thirdly, I believe that we're going to need a significant increase in research. And very interestingly enough, I think the areas that we talked about this morning are very much part of that process. It's not a case of growing more effective and better producing food in dry climates with higher nutrient values. It's the whole issue of getting food, the right food in the right place to the person who's going to consume it. We currently waste somewhere between 30 and 50% of the food produced in this world, of getting it from the farmer to the user. Poor communication, bad methods of storage, corruption, inefficient governments are all part of this process. We need to get over that, and we need research for that. I also suspect, ladies and gentlemen, Dave Baker's here, we also need research about how we use food. I suspect a lot of it's out there, but we need research of being able to convince people to eat differently, to absorb food that's going to be more difficult to produce more effectively. And that's going to be a real challenge. There are a lot of vested interests in that process. Fourthly, we need to improve our training and education, and I stress the word training. I say that at a time when we as a nation are producing fewer graduates out of our agricultural colleges and universities than we have in the recent past. And it will probably need more people. This is an issue which challenges us. But when we look at overseas and international area, and when we see where most of the farming community in the world comes from, this is a significant challenge because we're dealing with people who are largely illiterate. People who have generations of past policy and attitudes to overcome. People who live in areas that are poorly governed and are corrupt. How do we get the message through to them? It's a major challenge. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to finish by saying that we in Australia have, I think, a very significant challenge ourselves. We have an enormous opportunity in this country to produce a food, an agricultural and pastoral sector which would be world-class. We need it for our own evolving and expanding population, but we also need it recognizing that many of the globe's hungry people are going to be in our region. We need to overcome issues of aridification, of a decline in arable land, of a changing climate. And I believe that we have the capacity to do that in this country. Our biggest challenge, though, is to convince people that that is the case. People who are not immediately involved in the farming community. My sense is that this room should be full of people who are farmers as well. People who have influence and authority in these areas and who need to be advised and informed. Ladies and gentlemen, I've given you probably a fairly depressing type of presentation. I don't normally do those sorts of things. Thank you very much for your attention. I think this is an enormous challenge.